In the last video, we went through the spectrum of distinctiveness, and it's always worth asking whether the rules reflect actual reality or if the judicial intuitions that gave rise to the spectrum are open to challenge. It's also worth asking whether the spectrum of distinctiveness places too much weight on the meaning of words versus marketplace realities. Perhaps, for example, marketplace presentation matters a lot more than where a mark sits on the spectrum. For example, consider the role of product labels. Maybe all that really matters to consumer identification of trademarks is placement on a label in the place where you would expect a label to go. And maybe that prevails over whether a term is descriptive or generic, even though trademark law assumes that those kinds of terms are inherently unlikely or less likely to identify and distinguish goods and services. Now, there's a study on this issue by Thomas Lee, Eric DeRosia, and Glenn Christensen called An Empirical and Consumer Psychology Analysis of Trademark Distinctiveness. The article details a study that showed test subjects the word wonderful deployed on a box of chocolate coconut macaroons. And so you see on the screen the various permutations of the wonderful label used with different fonts and located in different places. And of course, wonderful is something that would be deemed to be a descriptive mark, and therefore not eligible for protection absent secondary meaning. And so you see different ways of using wonderful on a label, and you see that where wonderful is used as a typical trademark that is set off on a label with a distinctive font and graphical elements, there's very high consumer identification or very high respondent identification of that being a source indicator. When the trademark use is a little bit weaker, when it's in the trademark position, it's in a bigger font, but not necessarily delineated in the way a traditional trademark would be, there's still high identification. But identification goes down when the term is not used cleanly as a trademark, either because the font isn't set off as being distinct, or because the term is placed on a non-trademark position of the package. And so what's interesting is the possibility that, at least with respect to certain descriptive terms, the placement and the way the mark is used may actually loom as being more important than the kind of trademark category we place it in. So does this undermine the whole spectrum of distinctiveness? Maybe. I don't think so, though. First of all, people encounter trademarks in contexts other than labels, in conversations or other settings in which there's no label visible. But even leaving that aside, I think maybe the better answer to the question of whether or not the law should be more generous with respect to so-called descriptive marks is probably to focus less on consumer identification and more on competitive considerations. So consumers likely don't directly gain or lose too much if somebody can't claim a trademark for chocolate macaroons in the word wonderful. But letting somebody claim wonderful as a trademark too easily might open the door to mischief in the courtrooms as that company tries to use trademark law to limit the ability of its competitors to communicate information to the consuming public at large, going after the competitor who, though it does not use wonderful as a trademark, tries to call their macaroons wonderful. Now, we can handle this issue in a couple of ways. For one, we have doctrines designed to allow people to use words even if they are trademarks, and we'll discuss these defensive doctrines later on in the course in much greater detail. But it also might be worth it to try to head off the problem at the front end, to withhold protection from terms that might also be useful to competitors in the marketplace. And so we'll leave it there. Thanks very much.